Good morning, everybody. I'm Linda Feldman, the Washington Bureau Chief of the Christian Science Monitor. Our guest today is Brian Deese, Director of the White House's National Economic Council. This is we thought his second, but he says third. So
maybe. I can't remember.
It's been to multiple, but this is his first solo. So welcome back. The most important thing to know about Mr. Deese is that he's a graduate of Middlebury College, as am I, though we didn't exactly overlap. And I promised him we wouldn't obsess about Middlebury here, but and I suspect he did much better in econ class than I did. He's also a Yale law grad, which I'm not. During the Obama administration, Mr. Deese started as a special assistant to the President for Economic Policy and played a major role in the remaking of the American auto industry. He was also a key negotiator of the Paris Climate Agreement, and on Inauguration Day last year, he became director of the NEC. So, again, welcome. Now for the ground rules. We are on the record here. Please, no live blogging or tweeting. This is really important. In short, no filing of any kind while the breakfast is underway. But once we end, the embargo is off and you can file away. We will email pictures and a rough transcript to everybody shortly after this ends. And also, another important note, that the hotel needs this room to set up for another event as soon as we finish, so we're asking everybody to leave as soon as we conclude. And as you know, if you'd like to ask a question, please send me a signal and I will call on as many of you as possible. Now, Director Deese, if you'd like to make brief opening remarks, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Linda, and thank you to all of you. This is a great tradition, and I'm gratified to have an opportunity to be back here. So I am going to be very brief at the top. I just wanted to provide two pieces of kind of real live news this morning, and then I'm happy to take this conversation in any direction you all want. Outlook for the economy, implications of the war in Ukraine, anything else that's on your mind. But I just wanted to start with two live pieces of news. The first, and they're both connected to sort of core economic priorities we have. The first is on the Bipartisan Innovation Act, the act that has had many names, USICA, the Competes Bill, et cetera.
Sorry to interrupt, but you had said that you wanted to embargo.
The second piece of this about sanctions will need to be embargoed until 10:30. So we are announcing a new package of sanctions today. I'm going to go through all of the detail of that with you all because we're here. No, I'm fine, thank you. But that piece needs to be embargoed until 10:30. First piece is not embargoed. Okay. So we are going to be holding today a classified briefing, Secretary Raimondo, Deputy Secretary Hicks, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan with more than a dozen members of Congress, including Senator Cornyn, Senator Young, Senator Portman, and a number of representatives as well, to provide them with the latest analysis from the intelligence community and the Defense Department around the core vulnerabilities and risks to our economy and national security from the semiconductor supply chain. And this is, we've determined, important to provide greater visibility into what we are seeing from intelligence channels as well as from economic moves by key competitors, most notably China, around the escalating vulnerabilities we have from the semiconductors issue. I think you are all familiar with the issue broadly and the significance that semiconductors play in our economy. We've seen that in real time over the course of the last year. The best estimates are that the lack of available semiconductors probably took a full percentage point off of GDP in 2021. The piece that we will be underscoring in this briefing is the degree of forward vulnerability that we have around a supply chain which has largely moved overseas. And so today we produce 12% of global semiconductors in the United States, but we produce none of the advanced leading-edge semiconductors. So we are 100% vulnerable on foreign supply chains for those advanced semiconductors. And what we are seeing is a increasingly aggressive efforts by China and other countries to try to build their own resilience in semiconductor manufacturing, which, if not addressed effectively by the United States, would increase our vulnerability and our economic risk. And I won't go into the classified nature of what will be shared, but the risks are profound. We're talking on the order of multiples of the negative impact we saw in 2021 to our economy if we were to lose or have constricted access to semiconductor supplies. So that will happen today and is connected to our hope this week that before Congress leaves town, they will appoint conferees and get quickly to the process of reconciling and getting a bill to the President's desk to actually start to build our domestic semiconductor capability. That's piece one. Piece two is on sanctions, and again, this is embargoed until 10:30. We will be announcing with the G7 and the European Union a new round of sanctions this morning. This will include the consistent with the approach that we have taken here throughout this process. This approach will be coordinated with our European allies, and it will operate across the different categories that we have identified in terms of imposing economic costs on the Russian economy. The first of those categories is financial sanctions, and we will be announcing at 10:30 that we will be applying full blocking sanctions to Sberbank, as well as Alfa Bank. As many of you know, Sberbank is the largest. It's the largest bank in Russia. It alone transacts about 1/3 or holds about 1/3 of the bank sector's assets. We have heretofore not applied full blocking sanctions on Sberbank and are taking that step in conjunction with our allies today. Alfa Bank is the largest privately owned bank, fourth largest bank in Russia. We will do full blocking sanctions against them as well. The second is around focusing on key sectors, and as you all have seen, we have been using export controls and other measures to try to constrain and constrict key sectors that, of the Russian economy that are important to Vladimir Putin's ambitions. We will be taking additional steps today in that respect. Most notably, we'll prohibit all inbound investment in the Russian Federation by any U.S. person. So we have seen an overwhelming move by companies to take actions on their own to pull out of Russia and end investment in Russia. Today, we will prohibit any new inbound investment, either by companies in their own facilities or new companies, M&A, venture capital, what have you. We will also, in that context, be applying full blocking sanctions to a set of state-owned enterprises that, again, that operate in important sectors of the Russian economy, including the United Aircraft Corporation, the United Shipbuilding Corporation. Most of these large state-owned enterprises operate in very close connection to the Russian government, and we will be applying full blocking sanctions as well. We will also be extending blocking sanctions to a number of additional elites and their family members, including President Putin's adult children, former Mr. Lavrov's wife and daughter, members of the Russian Security Council, and others. Lastly, I would just point out that we have also took the step over the weekend to prohibit Russia from being able to make bond payments or debt payments with funds that are subject to U.S. jurisdiction, which has and will continue to make it more difficult for Russia to meet its payment obligations. So with that, I will stop.
All right, thank you.
And
I know there will be lots of follow-ups on what you just said, but I just wanted to ask you a big picture question. Your old boss, Larry Summers, had this to say last Friday on the economy. He said, "We do not do anybody a favor by overheating the economy, because when we overheat the economy, the chickens do come home to roost." So what's your response to the former Treasury Secretary? And I'm curious if you ever talked to him.
So on the second part of the question, I talked to Larry often. Part of my job is to do as much as I can, communicate with people inside and importantly outside of government, former officials, business leaders, labor leaders, etc. And so I try to spend as much time as I possibly can doing it. It's actually the hardest part of the job to find the time and the space to do that. But I talk to Larry often.
Okay. And what about this issue of an overheated economy?
So I think that the core question is whether the strength of the U.S. economy is now an asset or liability. And I think that if you look at where we have come and you look at where we are positioned vis-a-vis other countries around the world, our view strongly is that the United States, we have myriad challenges right now globally in the economy. We have a globally supply-constrained economy before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a significant supply shock to the global economy, which I'm sure we will get into. If you look at the United States is better positioned than any other country in the world to navigate through this very difficult period of time. And the reason for that is because the United States has very strong tailwinds to growth, strong consumer balance sheets and household balance sheets, and a very strong labor market. And those are strengths that we now that position us uniquely well. We have real challenges ahead of us. But I think that the fact that we had the strong growth that we had last year, the fact that we've had the astoundingly fast and strong labor market recovery, now position us as well as we possibly can to navigate through the challenges associated with inflation and the global supply shocks that we are seeing. So that's a specific answer to a generic question of, does it do any good to overheat an economy? I guess my specific response is what we have seen and what we have done over the course of the last 15 months is driven a uniquely strong economic recovery in the United States, which positions us uniquely well to deal with the challenges we're facing.
So I just want to ask you one follow-up on the EU about to put a ban on Russian coal. Can U.S. coal country ramp up production and exports quickly to help ease the crunch in Europe?
So I think that the EU is taking that decision from a position of confidence, maybe too strong, but of comfort that they will be able to sustain their energy needs even in lieu of that ban. That will principally be addressed by sourcing from within the European Union and by taking the actions that they've announced to actually reduce demand over the course of the next year. So I don't anticipate that it will be either necessary or that we will see a significant increase in U.S. exports in that context. I think natural gas is a different issue, which we could get into, and obviously it was a significant focus of the President's time and our team's engagement with the European Union to find a framework that will allow the European Union to transition away from Russian gas in a way where the United States will be an active partner in that context. I think gas is different.
Okay. Josh Boak from the AP.
Brian, thanks again for doing this. One big question going forward on Russia and Ukraine is the role being played by China in India. Malik Singh recently was in India. I've heard that China is sending mixed signals. How would you categorize their reaction to the sanctions, and what are you looking to see from them in the coming months ahead?
Well, I think that to date, there are certainly areas where we have been disappointed by both China and India's decisions in the context of the invasion. In terms of their reaction overall, at the same time, I think that I'd sort of separate them out with respect to China. We have a very open and direct dialogue with the Chinese government around their perspective and our expectations, and we've been very clear about our expectations in terms of not facilitating the continued operations or the continued military activity in Ukraine, and the importance of not undermining or providing economic outs for the Putin regime. And I think that, frankly, the question on exactly how that's going to transpire that answer has yet to be written. I think that what you've seen is the Chinese government trying to navigate this without tipping the scales too far. And our approach has been to be very clear and explicit about our expectations, and that's what we'll continue to do. On the Indian side is a bit different, and our message to the Indian government is that the costs and consequences for them of moving into a more explicit strategic alignment with Russia will be significant and long term, and that was certainly the message that Dilip carried, and is the message that we'll continue to reinforce.
All right, Emily Gooden from Daily Mail.
Hi, thanks, Brian. If I bring it back to domestic for a little bit, I wanted to ask you about this Deutsche Bank prediction that the U.S. will be in a recession by 2023-2024. And there's also a report that Secretary Yellen is going to be warning of a major economic repercussions coming out of Ukraine. So is the White House preparing for a recession, an economic meltdown, and what are you guys doing?
So we are always trying to look out over the horizon and understand the economic risks to the economy, and it is certainly the case that we are operating right now and living through a period of elevated risk. And the war in Ukraine is as I mentioned before, is a profound global supply shock, and the implications of which we are working through and living through in real time. With all of that said, our basic outlook remains that a couple of things. Number one, what's marked about the U.S. economy right now is the degree of resilience that we have seen, resilience in the labor market and resilience in consumption through a number of shocks, the most recent of which is profound in terms of the global supply shock from Ukraine. But if you had said that the U.S. labor market and the U.S. consumer would operate through Delta and Omicron and now the war in Ukraine, and you would continue to see record-breaking labor market performance, then that probably would have surprised people. I think that resilience is front and center. I'm not going to opine on there are lots of predictions out there, and I don't mean to be dismissive of them in any way, but the probability of recession thing is something that people that is always out there, and so even as we face real uncertainty, our view continues to be that we maintain strong resilience. that is unique, as I mentioned before, that is unique globally. And if we continue to execute effectively, we should be able to come through this period having built on those strengths and navigated through what will inevitably be a very complicated period for economic policy. To your point about Secretary Yellen, I think that we share the view that I just articulated. There's no question that the war in Ukraine is a profound global supply shock. I think the real issue is how well positioned is the United States to navigate through that, and I think the answer to that is uniquely well positioned.
All right, Jordan Fabian from Bloomberg.
Thanks, Brian. I got two for you, one on domestic and one on Russia. On the domestic side, can you give us an update on the, remnants of the BBB plan? Joe Manchin said he's not engaged in direct talks at the moment with the White House. Do you plan to start those, and can you just give us a status update on where that stands? And on Russia, we've seen the ruble bounce back to where it was pre-war. Is that a sign that the sanctions aren't as effective and have loopholes? And how do you go to the American people and ask them to continue to pay economic costs while the Russian ruble seems to be bouncing back?
So on the first, I would quite explicitly not comment on the conversations that are happening. We're gonna and I think the president has spoken to this publicly. But one of the things we are being explicit about is not playing out those conversations in public. I don't think that it's served anyone particularly well. But we are continuing to work and focus and make the case for an approach that we think makes a lot of economic sense right now, which is what are things that we can do to make things more affordable, lower costs for families who are facing significant pressures because of elevated inflation, and do that in the context of also lowering the deficit, which will have the end result of not only avoiding any inflationary impact, but actually helping to ease those price pressures from a fiscal policy standpoint. So the more wonky way of saying it is our fiscal policy prescription right now is very clear, and we think it's the right one, which is let's couple actions to lower costs for people with a package that would lower the deficit, and you end up doing what would be the right thing for the economy right now, which is giving consumers some relief while actually having fiscal policy play a moderating role on price pressures going forward. So that continues to be our framework. Obviously, there's a lot about the specifics, about elements of that. What I just said is certainly true of prescription drugs. It's true of most of what we're talking about on the energy side, et cetera. On the second question, look, I think that we need to have patience and perspective when it comes to the impacts on Russia of this unprecedented and crippling sanctions regime that we have now put in place. And we need patience and perspective. The president has been saying this from day one, that the reason why we have invested so much time in building a coalition and maintaining and sustaining a coalition around these sanction steps, including the steps that we're taking today, being able to do full blocking against Sberbank in a way where we're doing that in a unified way, is that the impact of sanctions operate across time. And you have to have the conviction, and they operate by maintaining unanimity and avoiding en routes. The data on the ruble, I think, is not indicative of an economy that is. Anyone who looks at the Russian economy right now and thinks that they're bouncing back or they're showing some signs of a life, I think, is missing the forest through the trees. The reason for the ruble rebound is principally a function of the contorted capital control regime that the Russian central bank and the Russian government are having to put in place, which is in and of itself bleeding them of resources. Most estimates are, it's hard to have an exact estimate, but most estimates are the Russian economy is now, on track to contract by 10 to 15% over the course of this year, which would be which would be historic and on the order of what they experienced in 1998. But the big important distinction from 1998 is that at that time, they had the international community and the international financial architecture behind them. They had the IMF that was stepping in with a program. Now they are completely ostracized because of the unanimity of the approach. And so a 10 to 15% decline in the economy. I think someone else pointed out that someone asked the question of whether Russia would attend the G20, and certainly we've been clear about our expectation that they should not. But by that point, they may be out of the G20 because the size of their economy will have shrunk such that they have fallen out of that club, in addition to having forced themselves out by becoming a global pariah. So the only other thing that I would say, because inflation is front of mind for a lot of people, but if you track weekly inflation in Russia for the last 4 weeks, it's been running at roughly 2% a week. So we've all gotten used to monthly inflation data, but 2% a week is like roughly 200% a year.
So that's 2% year over year?
No, 2% weekly.
Right, gotcha. Okay.
Which compounding would run at 200% over a year. Now, we don't expect there to be 200% inflation in Russia because we expect that to level off. But I think that's an indication of the degree of economic just the extent of the economic challenge that's operating on the ground in Russia today.
Okay. Jonathan Salant from NJ Advanced Media.
Thanks for calling on me. The president's budget did not mention state and local tax deduction, even though certainly the House and Senate Democrats made it clear that there's no tax reform without SALT provision. Why wasn't it in the budget, and where do you stand on the issue?
So, the president's budget reflects the president's priorities with respect to tax policy and tax reform. It's consistent with his prior budget, and it's consistent with where he was on the campaign. And his priorities in that context are, number one, demonstrating that we can raise more revenue while staying consistent to his campaign commitment to not raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000 a year. Number two, demonstrate how we can reform the corporate tax system in a way that reduces the incentive to offshore production and revenue, while raising additional revenue from the corporate sector. And number three, fixing the endemic problems in our tax system that lead very wealthy individuals on the individual tax side to pay nothing or next to nothing on their income for years and in many cases forever. And so those are the priorities from the president's perspective. His policies reflect ways to go at those priorities. And so that's been consistent, and that's been consistently where we have been in response to the question you asked about SALT, is that those are our priorities. We understand that Congress, members of Congress and Congress has priorities as well, and so those will get litigated out in the congressional process. But those are the president's tax priorities.
You support if Congress comes with a SALT fix? Would you support Congress, whatever Congress does on that issue?
Well, look, what I would say on that is the president has his tax priorities. The president wants to see those advanced. If we can come up, as you all have seen, the president is not only open to, but ready to, and demonstrate his ability to compromise to get things done. So certainly the president was strongly supportive of the House-passed reconciliation bill last fall, which the tax provisions in there reflected a compromise. There's a lot of things the president would like to get done that were not included in that context, but the president's prepared to support and sign compromise legislation on the tax side, provided that it can deliver on those core priorities.
All right. George Condon from National Journal.
Thanks. You earlier said that job growth has been astoundingly fast, but there was a recent poll that showed more voters believe that jobs have been lost the past year than believe they've gained. How do you explain that? How frustrating is it to you, and is there anything you can do?
I'll hesitate to provide commentary on my feelings.
Please don't hesitate.
Feelings are good.
This is a safe space. So, I guess I'd answer that two ways. One is actually factually, empirically, right? There's one answer. There's one answer to that question, which is, maybe the job growth and labor market performance has not actually been as strong. I think on that front, empirically, it's quite clear and stark. And in addition to the sort of headline statistics that you all know, in terms of overall job growth and the unemployment rate at 3.6%, I would note that we spent a lot of time collectively having a conversation, asking important policy questions about why weren't more people coming back into the labor market. But now, if you look 14 months in, the rebound in labor force participation, or the employee-to-population ratio, which economists tend to prefer as a measure of what share of the economy. If you look at prime age labor force participation, prime age employee-to-population ratio, we've seen historically strong rebound in the share of people coming back into the workforce. In fact, if you look past in the last 4 recoveries, including in the 1980s, it took years before you started to see a rebound in what's known as LFPR, right? And in this recovery, we've now seen particularly not only a recovery, but an acceleration in that recovery. So the last 4 months, we've seen labor force participation increase by more than it did over the prior 4 months, which is which means that on that question we were all asking of why aren't more people coming back to the labor market, the answer is they are. And they are in a way that is historically unique compared to prior recoveries. So sort of empirically, that's answer one. So the answer two is, what is the disconnect between people's perceptions and those outcomes? And I think it's not my particular comparative advantage to parse out the public opinion element of this. I think that, and certainly we recognize, and I want to underscore this, that sometimes this is positioned as what I would argue is a false debate between us saying the economy is great and nobody recognizes it, and other people saying, well, the economy's not perfect because there's real significant challenges, inflation is a real challenge, et cetera. Our view is not the economy is great, why isn't anybody noticing? It's that we need to recognize and build on the uniquely strong aspects of this economic recovery in addressing the clear ongoing challenges, particularly around inflation and costs for families. And I think that in that is part of an answer to the question, which is that it has been a very challenging couple of years for people living in this economy. The uncertainty associated with the unique pandemic dynamics, a unique pandemic economic recovery, where your ability to plan and structure your life have been uniquely disrupted. And the price pressures from inflation are real, and they create uncertainty, and they create challenges for families. And so I think that uncertainty is real, and that's probably an element of that. With respect to the very specific question of why don't people, recognize that the job growth and the employment and the unemployment rate have come down as fast, I think it's also a signal that we need to continue to make that case clearly and unambiguously. Again, without saying that means that everything in the economy is great, because that's not actually where we are. It's never where things are. But it's important that people recognize that the historic labor market gains, not necessarily for politics or for political credit, but because that historic labor market actually is creating opportunities for people. The more people recognize that there are job opportunities out there where they could get better pay or have new opportunities, that's a good thing. And so, it's something we need to continue to do and do a better job at.
All right, Story Hinckley from the Christian Science Monitor.
Chips. How do geopolitical tensions right now, particularly between China and Taiwan, accelerate the need for reshoring initiatives? And do you foresee that extending into other areas of manufacturing beyond chips?
Yeah.
At this scale?
Yeah. Well, look, I would say, I would answer the question this way, which is 10, 11 months ago, I went out and explained a core part of President Biden's economic strategy as having an affirmative industrial strategy for the country. And at the time, the question was, is that actually, why should we have an industrial strategy? Does that bring up echoes of failed industrial policy in the past? And I would say over the course of the last 10, 11 months, that question has now gone decidedly from why to how. That the debate around do we need to be more deliberate and explicit and have more direct and proactive public investment and public-private partnership to build industrial strength in key sectors of our economy is now much more broadly understood and a broadly shared goal across the aisle, Republicans and Democrats. And I think that is a function of two things. One, the pandemic has exposed deep vulnerabilities, economic and national security associated with the hidden costs of lean, efficient, just-in-time supply chains. And two, that the geopolitical realities and the geopolitical realignments that are happening have underscored that risk and also that opportunity. And so now it goes to the how. And I think that semiconductors is a place where we have a clear answer on that question. We've designed a package with broad bipartisan support, with input from experts, input from industry, of how it is that we will change that dynamic fundamentally, and we will position the United States to build capacity here and do so in a way that balances the important trade-offs of when you have an industrial strategy, you have to be cognizant of the ways in which it can go sideways. But we have that answer, and we just need to work to get it done and passed as quickly as possible. I think on your question, I expect and anticipate that it will extend. And, I will say we are intent on extending it. The president's actions last week to invoke the Defense Production Act, extend the Defense Production Act to the critical materials in the large capacity battery supply chain is an example of that. We intend to extend it to the large capacity battery supply chain because we see the national security and economic implications there. And I think we will be successful at doing that because there's there's pretty broad support for doing that.
To that extending question, really quick follow-up. How much of a priority is it to, as Intel CEO put it, develop a silicon heartland? Our other major semiconductor plants in the U.S., many of them are in the Southwest, and this one coming to Ohio. How much of a factor is the U.S. geography in all of this? So
I think it's a national security and a national economic imperative that we build that capability here. And to your point about the kind of existing fab capability and where it is geographically, the existing fab capability in leading edge semiconductors is nowhere. So part of what we need to solve is to build that capability in the United States from the ground up. Now, from a regional economic perspective, we at the national level are wonderfully agnostic. We love all of our regions. But I also think that one of the things that's really important and energizing, and why I think you are seeing this bipartisan support, is that people are starting to see that if we do this right, it will bring innovation and economic opportunity to parts of this country that have not necessarily seen themselves. So when we are looking at the kinds of places that companies are scoping out, Intel in Ohio, Global Foundries in upstate New York, places that have extraordinary assets and industrial capability, but have felt as if they can't see themselves in a kind of growing, thriving, innovative future. I think that's part of what we think is important about this. And when we talk about our industrial strategy, a key part of that is to execute policy in a way that makes sure that different parts of the country are benefiting from that, and that we don't end up, doing things. We have seen prior industrial strategies that have quite explicitly ignored or downplayed the importance of, geographic dispersion.
Jim Puzangara from the Boston Globe.
Hey, thanks. Building off of that, wondering if you could step back and talk more broadly about the long-term economic threat from China and what steps beyond the semiconductor production you foresee the administration possibly taking to deal with that.
Yeah. Well, if we step back, it's importantly connected to this last question, because the first answer to the question of, we are clear-eyed about the challenge and the competition that we have, and that we believe will accelerate, will not diminish, with China. The first and second and third most important thing we believe we need to do in that context is build our own domestic capability. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first is we believe that we will be best positioned to win that competition and engage where it's important and meaningful to engage with the Chinese if we can do so from a position of economic strength. And it's also important in a bigger picture sense that we need to demonstrate, and you've heard the president talk about this, but it does punctuate our strategy. We need to demonstrate that the American democracy can actually deliver those economic benefits, deliver that economic strength, because part of this is a broader question about can democracies together lead and demonstrate that they can deliver for their people. So that's why I would argue, number one, we have already made historic progress on that front. People often talk about the bipartisan infrastructure law in terms of bridges and roads and what it's going to do in terms of local economic development. I believe that the bipartisan infrastructure law is actually the backbone of a new American industrial strategy, that it is building the capability through dedicated multi-year public investment in key drivers of productivity, building the capability for the United States to actually play. Now, there is more that we need to do beyond that, because the bipartisan infrastructure law is not just about infrastructure, right? Building out broadband capability is a core national priority to position us to compete and win in the global competition for economic strength in the 21st century, right? But we now have the tools to do that. There are places where we don't have the tools. Semiconductors is a big part of that. Building resilience and strength in clean energy and clean energy technology is another place where we need more. We don't yet have the tools and the incentives that we need. But we're building on that foundation. And then the third thing I'd say is we are also clear-eyed about and prepared to take steps where necessary to actually confront directly where China's activities or actions are posing a direct economic threat, whether that's in intellectual property or that's in protecting industries in a way that actually is directly undermining U.S. jobs, U.S. economic opportunity.
All right, so we have 13 minutes and 5 people on my list. So
all right.
If you can
lightning
limit yourselves, yes, lightning round. One question, John Gizzi, Newsmax.
With all of the stimulus and infrastructure investment, how does the economy look for 23 and 24? Will it have an impact on the economy then?
So the infrastructure. So I would answer the question that way, which is, I guess a separate way of what you're asking is sort of what will the impact of fiscal policy be on the economy in 2023 and 2024? I would say the the first way I would answer that question is what's the impact in 2022? And right now, it is less well recognized, but I think economically very significant that we are living through the largest fiscal demobilization since World War II, meaning all of the investment, a lot of the investment that was made over the course of the last 2 years is now rolling off. The implication, of that is that's why we are projected to see historic reductions in the deficit this year. If you look forward to 2023 and 2024, that is a period where you will start to see the investment from the infrastructure bill ramp up. So on significant, initiatives like broadband that we just talked about, the bulk of that investment will actually flow into the economy in 2023 and 2024 because this year a lot of what we're doing is working with states and localities and jurisdictions and the providers to get updated maps to figure out how we actually effectively deploy this historic resource. That was by design and by intentional, that the infrastructure bill in almost all of its categories was not designed as stimulus and was designed as a multi-year public investment program. So you will see over sort of 2023 to 2025 that ramp up and get to, by 2025, you get to the sort of maximum annual investment levels, and then it begins to trail off because many of these are multi-year investments, but we don't need to sustain them permanently.
All right. To your right, Krista Case-Bryant from the Monitor.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been really helpful. I was just in North Dakota a few weeks ago talking with oil producers there and other folks involved in the industry. And one of the most surprising things to me is that even with the oil price more than doubling in a year, almost nobody has plans to ramp up production. And one of the the key limiting factors that I heard from everyone is the investment environment and how that's changed over the past few years. And some of them were grousing about 30-year-olds at BlackRock, which if I'm doing my math correctly, I think might have included you. So I'm just wondering, in this current crisis, could you speak to the way that the Biden administration is balancing climate policy with energy security, national security, foreign policy? And is there any thought of recalculating that balance to meet the demands of the day?
I mean, I turned 40.
Just after you started.
Just after I started, yeah. So I'm sure that there was somebody else that they were wrestling with. Look, I think we've been having these conversations with oil and gas producers as well, and I think that our takeaway from the data is that in the immediate term, over the next, call it 6 to 12 months, there is no constraint to companies ramping up production, and the price and the market environment provides a lot of reason and rationale for them to do so. And a number of companies, and I think this is important, that while I understand what you just said, a number of companies have now explicitly made decisions, are increasing CapEx, and the result of that is why we've now seen projections of U.S. domestic production increase, such that by third quarter of this year, the expectation is we'll be up by about 1 million barrels a day. And that is the result of people responding to market forces. We have been, the President of the United States has been quite clear that he would like to see more companies ramp production, and the idea that in this environment, that, as some have said, it doesn't matter how high the oil price goes, we're just not going to increase production, is a difficult proposition to support. But the question of, but I also understand that a lot of folks went through an investment environment where they took a significant hit during COVID, and their investors are communicating to them that they want to see discipline on that front. I think that's the short-term environment. I think that often gets.
To clarify, they were mainly talking about the shift toward ESG and away from fossil fuels toward green energy. And they did mention the overcapitalization of the industry, but I think their main concern was that because climate policy has become so, at the forefront, that's what they see as the difficulty of getting capital.
Look, I guess what I would say is that we've got, in the United States, we have the most deep and liquid capital markets, and there's a lot of capital out there that is interested in investing in productive assets. And I think that the market accurately recognizing and pricing the risks associated with climate and the transition, the low carbon transition, is like lots of things in the market, a important and appropriate thing for the market to be trying to price. So, that's if the I would leave to the private market the question of where capital gets allocated. From the policy side, what's clear is that in the short term, there's no policy barrier associated with ramping production. And that's clear because a number of companies are ramping production. And that's what is leading to this increase in production in the short term. So I'd leave it there.
All right. David Shepardson from Reuters, to your left.
Brian, you're the director of the Competition Council. Last night, JetBlue was buying Spirit. How open is the White House to increased consolidation in the airline industry? And are you concerned about reports of jet fuel price spikes and shortages in some places?
So I won't comment on the specific merger proposal as with all proposals. I think we have tried to state as a policy of the government that increased antitrust scrutiny and enforcement will be a priority for the enforcement agencies, the Department of Justice, the FTC, as well as other lesser known but very important enforcement agencies like the Maritime Commission and others. And so certainly the concerns about the economic benefit and consumer welfare from consolidation are ones that we take very seriously, and that you should expect to see our antitrust enforcement agencies to take very, very seriously. And I think that you've seen that over the course of the last several months. Jet fuel is something that we're paying close attention to and monitoring, and is a byproduct of a direct byproduct of the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact that it's having on energy markets, which affects petroleum that gets refined as gas at the pump, but also petroleum products. So it's something we're keeping a very close eye on.
All right, Eli Stokols from the LA Times.
Just to go back to the energy conversation real quick, you mentioned there are no constraints on the private sector producing more, but is the administration open to considering maybe using the Defense Production Act to spur them to, shale producers, for instance, providing more steel? Would that be an option to really encourage them to get more product to market faster?
So when I say there are no constraints, it's based on having sat with and solicited input from market participants. We have underscored that if there are practical and pragmatic issues in the very near term that operators are facing, that we're happy to sit down and talk them through and figure out if there is an appropriate federal role. And what we have heard principally is two things. One is some operators are saying that we are ramping production. We're ramping production as fast as we prudently can. This takes some time. It takes some set of weeks and months to reopen shuttered facilities. And then we've heard from others that they don't have an interest or intention to ramp for other reasons. So I guess that the straightforward answer is we are open to practical and pragmatic ideas as long as they're grounded in real, not imagined constraints.
So safe to say that is something that would be considered.
Well, it's not something that has come up because we've not seen anyone identify that the but-for constraint to increasing production is it's not clear why or in what context that tool would be necessary. But more generally, it's a conversation that we're having around if there are constraints, let's understand them.
Okay, last question, Justin Worland from Time.
Okay, my question is about climate. I'm curious, the administration, yourself included, has spent a lot of time engaging the private sector, whether it's on Build Back Better or public-private partnerships. So just to keep it very quick, what's the strategy on private sector engagement on climate? Has it changed in year 2 of the administration after Build Back Better, challenges with Build Back Better?
So it's a sort of good segue on this, which is I think the war in Ukraine and the geopolitical consequences of energy that we are seeing play out now really do provide as stark a reminder as anything of the need to accelerate our transition to ultimate energy independence, which ultimately means reducing and eliminating our dependence on fossil fuels altogether. And that is a process that will only happen if the American private sector, including the incumbent energy producers in the United States, utilities and otherwise, are a inextricable part of that process. And that's defined our approach from the get-go. We've designed the policy that is embedded in for example, the clean energy tax credit package that we have been working on is designed explicitly with the understanding that what we will do on the government side is provide long-term technology neutral incentives that the private sector then will drive and innovate off. So our core engagement approach has not changed. The dynamics around it certainly have. In some places, accelerating opportunities, for example, partnering with companies around building more domestic capability to produce the input components that go into batteries, that go into solar and wind. There's now more appetite and enthusiasm around that. We're partnering on those types of things in a deeper way than we have before. But the core theory of we need to accelerate, and we're going to need to do that in a way where the government provides long-term incentives and the private sector operates to drive those at scale remains.
All right. We're at 10:01. Thank you very much for coming. Hope you'll come again. And thank you, everybody, for asking such great questions.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
All right.